Welcome to the Spirit of Business, episode number 78, Integral Accounting, Part 1, with Matt Murphy and Sarah McCrum.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Matt.
Today I'd like to speak about a topic that we raised in the previous podcast that I thought would be really good to talk more about, which is this concept of integral accounting. And I know that you've gone and done some work in this particular space, and I think you've been to a conference or a seminar to understand what integral accounting is. And I remember that what we've done is, in the business that we work in together, we've been through that as an organisation to work out how we put that philosophy into our business. And so I think it's really, really good to talk about that, because I found it enlightening in terms of it brought together a number of different facets for me that made a lot more sense. And having an accounting background as I do, it was nice to sort of see a bit of a holistic approach, not necessarily just talking about the triple bottom line that we're used to talking about in accounting and business, but expanding that to the integral accounting process. So if it'd be okay today, I'd love to really talk about that further and understand it from your perspective, and for you to explain integral accounting. So if I could ask you to do that, that'd be great. And I'd love to also share my experience along the way around what I learned when we went through the process too.
And it might be interesting also, even as you listen, you might reflect on other clients, people who you work with, and what effect it would have on their business if they took a more integral approach to accounting. Because I'll give you a little bit of background first of all, because I am not the guru of integral accounting. You, in my world, are the accounting guru, and I definitely am very much about integral, like wholeness, and like that's very important to my work. And I went and did a course with a guy called Dr. David Martin, which is called Integral Asset Management. It's something like that. It's Integral Accounting for Asset Management or something like that. Anyhow, it's really for people who have investment portfolios. And I wanted to learn the integral approach to accounting because, as you know, and as I've shared on this podcast, and I've come to understand better over time, when people bring things down to the numbers, I always feel as though we're missing most of what's important. And I felt frustrated with myself as much as anything else, and often felt like I was almost like a bad person because I found it so hard. I could see that what the numbers were doing, I'm not stupid or switched off from them, and I've learned those things about all those little levers you can pull, and if you increase this and you increase that, you increase your profit here and there. And I had an action coach once and all of these things, and yet I always felt there was something missing, and I don't think I actually identified what it was that was missing. So I just thought, I'm somebody who doesn't relate to numbers, I relate to something else. But I don't think that was the issue. I think actually I was looking for a more literally integral way of summing up a description of the performance. It's not only the performance, but the kind of almost like the profile of the business that is more in line with what the business really is. And I think the reason I felt disappointed when it comes down to the numbers is because almost the whole story of everything got lost. And so it felt actually much poorer to me than it was. Now, if you had very big numbers, you might feel it's very rich, but I'm actually not sure that that's true. I think the richness comes when we look at the richness of what lies inside the business. And rich is a word I use a lot because it's not just about having lots of money. It is really about having a richness in your experience and in your life. So that's why I went and did that course. And it was, I don't know, probably four weeks long of like 2-hour seminar. So it was quite, we went into quite a lot of depth. And the guy who runs it, David Martin, is absolutely amazing. And he's been running this system for his own business and for his life and for he runs a hedge fund and various other investment kinds of business. He runs it across everything that he does. And the thing that most intrigued me, excuse me, was when he said that when anything is out of balance on this integral accounting system, which I'll describe in more detail, you don't feel good.
Mm.
And I literally thought of you when he said that, because I thought, feeling good is so important, and it's something you've often been searching for. You feel it more now, I think a lot more now than you used to, but it's for you really important in business. You want to feel good in business.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
if you've got something that tells you, if I'm not feeling good about my business in some way, I kind of know where to look, rather than just like, what's wrong with me, or what's wrong with the business, or what's wrong with the world, or the questions that we normally go to. I thought that that's a really useful thing. And it shows us where to kind of make corrections or adjustments so that we can feel good again about our business.
And I think that's a really good way of describing the benefit of actually having, and really I see it as a framework. And accounting and business and is all structure, right? It's all frameworks and structures and that sort of type things. The way that my brain works, as you know, being sort of growing up in that sort of accounting business world that I do, and entrepreneurial spirit. The point that you made then was very valid. Is that we want to feel good in business, we want to feel good in life, really, and we don't always feel great. And sometimes we know why we don't feel great, and other times we don't know why we don't feel great. And I think by actually having a framework where you can step through and almost, go through, well, is this in balance? Is this working well? Is this not working? And then that's when you can start to drill into, well, actually, now I've pinpointed why it is not feeling good, because once you're out of balance, I think that's when you don't feel good. And this is the point about integral. And your point a minute ago is that if one element of that is not in balance with everything else, it's not feeling good. And that's why I think the overall essence of this is a really good thing to explore.
Yeah, so the system works on it has 6 elements to it. And money is one of those elements, just to put it into context. So, and the idea is that in your business or in your portfolio, you would have a balance of all those 6 elements. So in a portfolio, a sixth of your portfolio would be devoted to each element. And in your business, the idea is the same. Now, we are only in the process of getting this going. So we've done the early stages of exploration, and I think that alone was really helpful. Be very useful in 6 months or a year's time when we're accounting on that system, to actually look at how that's affected our business. But we're not there yet. So I want to say, like, I can share what I can share at the moment, but I think that there's a lot more to come from it. So I'm just going to go through the elements one by one, and maybe we can stop with each one and talk about it a little bit as well. But the first element in the original system that I was taught is called commodity. So it's the raw energy or the raw resources that are involved. Now, in investment, we know perfectly well what commodities are. But when I came to look at business, it's a really different thing. Now, if you have a publishing business, obviously trees, not a publishing business, but a printing business, for example, trees, wood, is part of the raw resource of your business, so the raw energy that your business is formed. If you make printers, for example, then the metals and the plastics are the raw materials. But in this business, which is an education business, I was looking at it and thinking, well, we have a computer each. There's a little bit of metal and plastic and stuff that goes into that, but that's so insignificant in terms of the raw materials. So I asked myself, what are the raw materials of our business? And I started to look at it. This was very interesting for me, in terms of what is the natural resource of our business, because that's what a commodity is. And we tend to see human beings as people who act on nature rather than being part of nature, but I see human beings as being a part of nature. And I realized that this is a business where the raw energy comes from human beings. And so I relabeled it. I don't call it commodity, because to call a human being a commodity is as appalling as it is to call a tree a commodity. Like, the idea that a tree is there for the taking and is more valuable dead than alive that alone is a kind of abomination if you think about it. Like, how could we ever have created an economy where trees have more value when they're dead than when they're alive? That's
Mm.
so upside down. So I took out the word commodity because it doesn't feel good, and I called it energy. And I didn't call it energy in terms of, the energy, universal energy or life energy, although it is that. But really, what is the raw, natural energy of our business? And it is people. So then what we did as a team is we started looking at what does that mean in the context of our business if we look at the raw energy of our business. So we started looking at the people involved in our business. And when I first thought about this and introduced it to the team, I had a very poor picture. I just saw, oh, there are 5 of us. That's it. That's the raw energy of the business. But when we started to talk, it was like, oh my goodness, there are so many people who are all part of that raw energy. So we started to, we have our team. And then because of the way we're structured, we have some other businesses that we work really closely with, but they're not really our team. So they're like our very close suppliers. And then we have some businesses that we work with from time to time, also suppliers. And then we started to think about, especially about the clients, and how the energy that they supply to our business is a core part of the business itself. And then we started to think about the people who are in our business ecosystem, who may not be clients yet. They may be doing free stuff, they may be hanging around, but actually they also give a lot of energy to us. I know that because they bring a lot of enthusiasm to my business and heart. They love what we do. And they also often refer other people, even if they don't do stuff themselves. They talk about us. And so there, even those people who are kind of in the ecosystem but not financially engaged are a part of that pure energy that keeps us running every single day. And we started kind of trying to put that onto a slide, like we're building a little deck at the same time, and we started having all these little gold circles everywhere, representing the different groups of people. And from that element alone, I can remember the shift. It was like, wow, this business feels so much bigger to me than when I just look at the financial numbers. I started to appreciate a richness that has been developed over years, actually, of communicating with people and building trust and building relationships and providing experience for people that, that they connect with and resonate with and often really love. That there's tremendous value in that. And of course we can say, yeah, we know there's value in networks. But how often do we actually look at the real value of that? Because it isn't just the money. It really is the love and enthusiasm and the good words that people say and the appreciation that make it something that you feel happy to grow. And I know for me, like if I didn't feel that appreciation from people, I wouldn't want to grow it. Even, when you're hungry for money, but to grow something for money that that other people don't feel good about or you don't feel good about, that's really hard to do. Whereas if you just feel that you feel that kind of goodness in it, it becomes a much easier thing then to grow naturally. So that's what I came to with that first element.
Which makes sense. So going back to your point before about sometimes I like to describe things in a way that if you look at what you don't want or the negative aspect of it, it helps to describe the positive and what you do want. And so if we go back to that concept of saying when something feels out of balance, then it doesn't feel right. So in this particular piece, you started to touch upon it to say, well, what doesn't feel right and what don't you want and what would actually create it to being out of balance in the other 5 areas that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, and you can start to see, I started to see as we went through this, so what are the things that we might measure or keep track of to see how we're doing? And it's probably, in this particular case, it's not a question necessarily like on our team. It's not how many people do we have on our team, but do we have the right people for the job that we're doing? And do we feel good about each other? And is it working well? Those are really useful questions to answer. Whether we have 5 or 7 people isn't so important as do we have the right people for the job and are we working well together? So you start to look at the quality that exists there. But in terms of people in our ecosystem, it might be really interesting to see how many people are entering the ecosystem by signing up for something every week, for example, because that gives us a sense of how we're growing our reach, what kind of influence, and then we might look at the quality of interaction we're having with them. Are they giving us the signals that they're really appreciating what we're doing, or are we finding, people not appreciating it? So we start to look at the quality. Where is quality important and where is quantity important? And we can make a decision for each aspect of it. Like, it doesn't matter how many suppliers we have or how few, counting them doesn't make any difference. But do we have the right suppliers? That's really important. Are we getting everything done that we need to have done? Do we have good relationships with them? Do we love working with them? Those things to me are really important.
And so therefore it becomes a quantitative measurement in terms of how do we feel about it. Now, sometimes that gets into this. This is why
I call that qualitative rather than quantitative.
Qualitative, sorry. Yeah, sorry, I meant
yeah.
Qualitative to be trying to get quantitative in qualitative in that mix between the two. And I'll kind of explain what I mean by that. But when we were going through this, I remember that we spoke about this is kind of what it feels like and describing and defining, what the energy actually meant. And then being able to define what feels good compared to what doesn't feel good. So then we can tap into, well, do I feel like we're on the right pathway for this particular area, or there needs some love and attention, some work for it? So this is where we started to say, well, how do you actually then measure or monitor that to then work out whether you feel good or not so good about that? So you just touched upon it then that, we started to look deeper into how do we feel about it. And, I was even thinking, when we're going through it, is it as simple as having smiley face, middle face and sad face to describe how we feel about that particular aspect of the relationship that we may have?
Interestingly, in the course that I did, that's exactly what David Martin did. He would get you to
describe
that, let's say, the commodity aspect of an asset in your portfolio. So let's say I was thinking about our farm, and then I could think about all the commodity aspect of that, the land and the house and the materials and everything there. But underneath there would be pretty much a smiley face. Like, how do you feel about that? And I know for myself, like if I would look at let's say the people who are joining our ecosystem, and if there were a lot of people joining our ecosystem who I just felt like we don't even really want to be working, we're getting the wrong people in, we wouldn't feel good when we look at that. Or if we were working with suppliers who don't understand what we're about and are causing us trouble or are not paying on time, you just take one look at that group and you start to not feel good about it. And then you can say, okay, why do I not feel good about it? It's because they never pay. No, we pay them, don't we? It's whatever it is. They don't perform on time. Like they don't get the jobs done in time, or they're not doing a good job. And then it's like, oh, okay, that's the reason why we don't feel good about it. And then we can figure out what to do. So in a funny kind of way, the smiley face is actually quite a good idea. I think maybe we should put it in there.
I like to be simplistic sometimes when it comes to measuring things, and because if we're talking about how we feel, that facial feature of smile, sort of indifference, and then sad sort of does represent probably from an inner perspective how we feel about things.
Yeah, and the last thing I would ever want to create out of something like this is a really complicated system.
Yeah.
I just would like something that represents that richness and allows us to identify very quickly if something's going off track, and also allows us to appreciate what we're doing well. Because pretty much with those things, I would imagine, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine things are in pretty good condition to grow then.
Absolutely. So there's 6 elements. So we've covered off on one. I'm sure.
The other ones will be quicker because we've got into a way of thinking now. So the next
that's all right. This is either going to be a long podcast or we're going to have to divide it up into 2, one or the other. So.
No, I'm going to get them all done. So the second element was originally, David calls it, something custom and culture. And that was interesting for me. His language he uses different language from me. We actually changed it into culture and stories. Really, custom and culture is all of the stories that go with that accumulate over the history of a thing. So, for example, if I look at my farm as an asset, there are stories about that farm. It used to grow beans and then it was overgrazed by cattle. These are stories. There are stories about the house and the families that have lived there and why there are 7 sheds on the property. It's like, all these things are part of the story of it. And they make a difference to things that happen there. Like beans don't seem to like to grow very well on our farm at the moment. I'm sure it's because there have been too many there in the past. It's part of the story. But if we look at the business, we started to look at all the stories that are involved in our business. And again, I had that experience of it being very enriching because we created this slide and we started to look at, so there's the story of the history of the business itself, how it got to be where it is now, and of the people who are very closely associated with it. There are the stories that we tell all the time about who we are and why we are who we are and what we do and those kinds of things. There are the stories that have accumulated from all our clients. They're all the client stories. There are stories that our clients go and tell their friends about us that we never hear. That was a real beautiful eye-opener for me. It's like, oh my goodness, there's this ripple effect of stories. And I see on Google, people come and look for Sarah McCrum because somebody's told them, oh, you should read Sarah's book, or, I saw this person. And those represent stories that we'll never be able to control, but we do influence.
I love the word story, and I love it being in the matter of business to say we're telling stories in business, because a lot of the time people say in business it's a case study. So it's a case study of a thing, and case study sounds so commercially wrong, but it's a business term, or it's something we say, oh, what's a case study about that? But I love using the word story rather than case study to describe a history, or describe an event, or to describe a relationship, or a feeling, or a transaction, or a meeting, or something like that. And I love that concept of building stories or talking about stories that then represent the cultural elements of the organization.
Because imagine if we got the feeling like, or we started to get feedback that there are all these people telling bad stories about a course that we've run. We would immediately not feel great about that. And we'd immediately know, okay, we need to do something there. And so again, it becomes an indicator of something. Or if we're really poor in stories, for example, last week I recorded 5 people who just completed a program that I was running. They came to a webinar for new people and they talked about their experience, and they talked for maybe 20-25 minutes. It was an incredible they were just telling their stories of who they are and how they've changed, and it was such a rich experience. If it had just been me trying to tell those stories, it would have been a completely different thing. So when people tell their stories, you get an enrichment, I think, in the business. When you try to control the story and manage the story too much, there's an impoverishing effect that happens there. So that was very interesting for me. Like, how do we create an environment where people are spontaneously and naturally telling great stories about the experiences they're having in our ecosystem, without us having to tell them all the time what stories to tell? We'll tell them certain elements because that's what our marketing and communication is all about. But if they spontaneously do it, that, to me, that's very valuable.
There's no bigger accolade, I don't believe, when somebody tells a story about an interaction that they've had with you, or a feeling that they've had. And I think that's great to capture that. And once again, capture it, because we've spoken about this before, that I feel in certain times of business disconnected with it. And sometimes I feel disconnected from it because of the fact that probably I haven't had somebody tell me a story about their connection with the organization. And when I do get that story, and when somebody talks about their experience with the organization or the organizations that I've been involved with, there's this strong connection that occurs inside of me where I go, oh, I feel good again because I'm actually living the purpose of why this organization exists, and I'm getting feedback that it's actually having an impact. Whereas if you don't get those stories coming through, you don't feel, I mean, you can feel it inside you to know you're doing good and to know that you're doing the right thing and to see it. But I think it's a very powerful thing to actually get physically a story coming back to you to say, hey, this has been my experience, and I really appreciate it.
That's actually really that shows me even more how valuable it is, because we know that you can run a business, at least for a period, maybe it's not sustainable, where you're not necessarily creating great stories. You might be selling great stories, but you're not necessarily creating great stories. But those stories become a proof point. They become a way of checking, actually, whether the business is doing what the business does and whether it's doing it well. And you can't necessarily read that from the numbers, because I know businesses, and you will know much more than me, where maybe it's just a short-term thing because they can't sustain. Like if you oversell and overpromise and then the stories don't match up, you can't keep doing that for a long time. So the stories that are being told are actually part of what needs to be evaluated. I like the word evaluation because it has value right in the heart of it, and it allows us to be more flexible in how we assess what's going on. But to evaluate the stories is not just a nice to have. What you just described is it's essential.
Yeah, and what you just said then too is that if it's out of balance between what you think the story of the business is compared to what other people do, and there's an out of balance with that I might be, like you said, selling something, but the experience is different to what I'm selling. There's a sustainability issue with that, and if we don't get into alignment, that's when it doesn't feel good. And I think that's also worthwhile highlighting as well.
Yeah. And so then you start to inquire, what kind of stories should I be telling? And what kind of stories should I be encouraging? So it's making me look more at the stories that we encourage, because information comes through those stories. Again, the word enrichment comes. It's like a very enriching process when you engage with the stories and you can ask questions about them.
So once again, if we're trying to then work out whether we feel good, bad, or indifferent about that from a feeling sense, we need to be able to work out how we sense that. And is it do we need to make sure that we're capturing all those stories coming through, good, bad, or indifferent as well, so then we can see what the output of the organization actually is. Is that kind of how you see you can determine sort of whether you do feel good about this part and whether it's in balance or not?
Probably, you probably would understand me that I'm probably not going to use a word like capture. I personally feel that you can record some stories. And I think that the beautiful thing about storytelling is that it's very out of control in a way. And so I think it is important for us to look at ways, and I know that in this business we need to look at some better ways of recording stories. There are some things that work really well. We get very good spontaneous stories and very good feedback coming in, but we don't always do it very rigorously, and there's room for recording more of that and also analysing it to some extent, just to see what's going on, especially client stories. I think that's very important. And it's quite a big thing to do that. So, yes, to me it's about what kind of stories can we record and are valuable, and then also how do we influence just what happens on the airwaves, which we will never know. But if that part is good, then I'm pretty sure that everything's good.
That's good. So the third principle?
And I'm going to have to eat my words. We're going to do 3 today, and then I think we'll have to do 3 next week. Definitely judged that one wrong. The third one is knowledge. Now, in a portfolio, a knowledge business would most likely be some kind of education business, whereas the custom and culture business might be something like a media kind of company. the organizations that kind of create and uphold and generate stories, but the knowledge is more education piece. And clearly we know that that's very important in a business. We don't always, I think, recognize the value of it because so often it has to be justified. Like education in a business has to be justified in a way that other things don't. But if you start to unpack the knowledge within the business, it's different from the stories. The knowledge is kind of almost like packaged. It's the stories that turn into patterns, that become principles, that become something that can be shared over and over again. And this was also very eye-opening for me because I tend to teach very spontaneously and I can communicate without lots of preparation and those kinds of things. I don't always appreciate the knowledge that sits inside there, but I started to recognize all these assets that we actually have in our business, which are knowledge-based assets, the books, all the courses that are pre-recorded, that are a packaging of knowledge into a form that can be shared with other people. So you start to see the interaction now. We've got these energy resources of people. In this particular case, to begin with, it's me and 30 plus years of study and all of that. Then you've got the stories that have built up over all of that time that have gradually turned into knowledge. And that knowledge then becomes something that can be shared. That knowledge is going to turn into money, which will be the next element we'll get to next week. So all of these different elements, they have interactions with each other, which is really fascinating. But it's not just my knowledge. I'm the main knowledge holder in terms of what the business appears to be. But it's actually the knowledge of everybody who works in the business. It's your knowledge of business. It's everybody else's knowledge that they've grown from being in the business. So the skills they've learned with it, and knowledge that they brought, knowledge of life, knowledge of other things that they brought into it. It's also the knowledge and the education that we provide to ourselves as part of doing business. And so we can assess, is there stuff that I need to learn to be able to do my work better? But it's also the knowledge that's being built in clients and knowledge that our suppliers have. Like, are we choosing people who really have the knowledge that we want? We start to look at it in those terms, and I think we make wiser decisions as a result of looking at the knowledge component.
You know what I love about this too is that, and this particular area being knowledge, is a lot of the time as individuals, we don't really fully appreciate the knowledge we have, and hence the power that we have in terms of being able to do things. And we've spoken about this before, and I love the concept of superpower. So we've all got superpowers and typically our superpowers are probably what comes easy to us. So therefore we don't recognize them or acknowledge them or actually then celebrate them as much. And what this focus of knowledge does in the pure essence of it is really identify all the knowledge of the organization, which means it's all the individual knowledge, which is really the superpowers of each individual person coming together to create something unique and special.
Which is a whole new body of knowledge.
Correct.
Yeah. And something clicked for me when it was all put on this slide, and all these little things like books, ebooks, courses, all of those different things were written on the slide, and that was just a small part of the knowledge. And then it dawned on me, there is a wealth of knowledge in this business. There is such a wealth. There's a wealth of energy, people. There's a wealth of stories. There's a wealth of knowledge. They all connect with each other. And so you can see the shift that happens because I started to feel the wealth of the business instead of just looking at that kind of bottom line thing, which just shows 1/6 of what's going on.
So it creates the opportunity to focus on these things. And I think that's what I love about it is that it actually gets you to stop and reflect on each element of the business rather than just a couple of the elements. Okay. So you're starting to look at it holistically, and that's the part of the integral aspect of it, is that then because we lose sight of it. And when we get into the detail of the day-to-day business, we get focused on certain elements of it, and usually the problems that are in front of us. But when you get to stop and reflect and you go, oh, this is really awesome, because every business has got a huge amount of knowledge because it's got a huge amount of people in it and therefore has this sort of power associated with it. But unless you stop and reflect and look at it, you're not going to necessarily get the benefit of that, because when you stop and look at it, you can, as you say, reframe, think about what's missing, what can I improve or increase my knowledge if there's gaps in there as well. So it really forces you to look at it from a holistic sense, as you say, but focus on the good bits and where the gaps are and what we need to do to make it more into balance.
Yeah, and it's not that other businesses don't think about knowledge and don't think about education that's needed. They do, but the thing that I love about this that's beginning to emerge is that we could, even monthly, you and I could sit down and do an assessment across all of these things in 5 to 10 minutes, literally. And that would be useful as an ongoing thing, over a quarter, or equally, we could spend a whole quarter just looking at how do we grow better stories in this business. So we can take it as a very fast, almost intuitive tool. We can create qualitative and quantitative data about it, and then we can use it as a tool for going deep into an area, but making sure that we take care of each area in a kind of whole way as well.
Because I think that's a very good point to make, that I sit in lots of board meetings and advise lots of business owners, and we do cover off on a lot of these elements. So it's not like we're just completely blind to it and we only look at the financials. That's not true. We look at all these things, but the reality is that we may not necessarily look at them from a balanced perspective, and we may not necessarily look at them continuously, holistically, if I want to say it that way. And so therefore, we still will gravitate towards the one thing that's causing us probably the most amount of grief, give it a lot of airtime and a lot of focus, which you need to sometimes. But I still think it'd be nice to if you have this framework in place, it requires you to ensure that you're looking at all 6 elements rather than just, the one or two that are probably needing that focus at that point in time. So it creates that awareness and that lift.
And what I can see is that there is still always a tendency to sum up the final thing in terms of the numbers. And if we could say the sum up of the final thing is on these 6 things, and the numbers are 1/6 of the story. And that's what we need to do next, is figure out how we're going to do that. But I think that would be, and it wouldn't take as long to do. I don't think, we wouldn't need a whole accountant doing all the work that they do to do our accounts and bookkeeping. But I think that would be will be a very valuable exercise as we get to grips with that.
I agree. So given the fact that we've probably come to the end of the 3rd one and that we've got another 3 to go, it might be worthwhile, leaving the listeners in anticipation of our next podcast that will be unveiling the next 3 elements. And then how we pull the whole thing together, as you say, I think is really important too.
Yeah. Well, it's actually really great just to talk about it, because every time I talk about it, I see a bit more of what's possible with this. It grows my perspective of it. So I'm really grateful that you actually brought it up. You brought it up in the last podcast.
Well, thanks for sharing once again, Sarah, and I'm looking forward to our next instalment of talking about integral accounting.
Great. Thanks, Matt. You've been listening to The Spirit of Business with Matt Murphy and Sarah McCrum. If you'd like some insight into the spirit in which you do business, a great place to start is by looking at your relationship with money. Find out more by taking the Money Scorecard at moneyscorecard.app, and we'll be back next week.